Hey friends, if you're new to the channel, my name is Gauri and I'm a software engineer from Singapore now living and working in Berlin, which is exactly what this video is going to be about. I moved to Berlin about a year and 1 month ago, and I've been working here for a year. So it's pretty interesting to share how things have been going so far. What might be even more interesting is my decision-making process behind why I chose to move from Singapore to Germany. So that's going to be in the first part of the video, and then I'm going to share some specific questions revolving working in Germany. This video is going to be pretty long, so feel free to skip through the timestamps. And I have some tea ready for me to spill the tea and some vitamin water. So I'm ready, grab a tea yourself and let's go. So I have my iPad here for some notes since there's quite a few things to run through. So if I look down, that's literally what I'm looking at. But first, let's talk about why I decided to move to Berlin. There were a lot of different things that took place before this decision popped up in my mind and before I ended up making the decision. In fact, if we rewind all the way back to 2019, 2019 was the year that I graduated, and I was under a certain scholarship that required me to work in Singapore for 3 years at least. And because of that, I didn't have to think much about where I was gonna work after graduating. It was kind of defaulted to finding a local company in Singapore and then working there. So 2019, I started my first job in Singapore as a software engineer. But as I was doing that, I always wanted to go to Europe, and I don't know why I always wanted to work there as well. Also because I did work in United States, America before, and that experience was pretty similar to how work life is in Singapore. And for me personally, I wanted something that had a bit more work-life balance. That's just the type of life that I think I craved, or I thought would work the best for me. So because of that, I traveled to Europe in 2019. I went to Amsterdam, Paris, and Barcelona because these were the 3 cities that I thought I might want to move to in the future. So it's good to do like a vetting process by traveling there and seeing if I would want to move there. So the trip went amazing. It was like a solo trip and I met some friends here and there, but I couldn't imagine myself living in any of those cities. Like Barcelona was way too chill for me. Paris was too fashion-ish for me. I don't think it was my vibe at all. And Amsterdam was amazing, but it also felt way too chill. So coming from Singapore, which is a very fast-paced work environment, it was hard for me to choose which place in Europe I wanted to move to that would be able to suit that similar vibe and yet a little chiller. Basically, I didn't know what I wanted. And then 2019 went by, I came back to Singapore. I kept working as a software engineer in the company in Singapore, where it was the typical Singapore work life, especially what I experienced and what I've heard from my other peers experience as well, where you work more than 8 hours a day, which is very common. You do tend to do OT. Some people get compensated for it, some people don't. My company, you didn't. And it's just the norm. Like for me as a student who just graduated, I didn't know anything else other than to work extra hours because that's just what was considered normal there. And it's a very hustle culture. So everyone's talking about stocks. How do you make more money? How do you find a better job that makes you more money? So I feel like there's a lot of financial motivation in Singapore, especially with maybe it's just a group of people that I surrounded myself with. And I was one of them as well, so I'm not complaining, but that was just what the vibe was. So 2019, 2020, it was largely financially motivated. And that's when COVID happened, so I didn't think much about moving to Europe at all. But in 2021, my scholarship no longer required me to serve 3 years in Singapore. I could move overseas as well. And that's where the whole decision-making process started. Because I always wanted to move to Europe, but this was when I could potentially actually do it. And then there was the big question of, should I do it? Because there were 3 tiers in my life that I thought would mess up if I made this move. So the first one was my work growth. I didn't know if working overseas would give me the same progress, I guess, in a way, as working in Singapore perhaps might. When it comes to work, I think I was concerned more about if I would be able to find a job that allows me to keep progressing as an engineer, to learn things about coding, software development, as well as more about the back-end stuff, because that's where I was starting to get interested in 2021. I didn't know if I could find a company that was able to fulfill that, because my company in Singapore was helping me do that. I had good mentors there that I was able to ask questions to. I was able to lead certain projects and I felt like there was growth as a software engineer there. So that was my first big question, like would I be able to find a job that fulfills this progressive growth that I require in a career. The second thing that I was concerned about was the social life. This was a big concern for me. The only other country that I lived before in other than Singapore is United States of America, and over there I lived with other Singaporeans as well because we went there as a part of a university program. So I usually just hung out with my friends there, which was a lot of fun. But I know that if I move to Europe now, other than my partner who was in Europe, I didn't know any other people. So having to create a social life from scratch would be pretty difficult and not the ideal solution. Also because growing up in Singapore, and if I continued to live there, it would have been a lot easier to just keep within this comfortable community of people that I knew and that were friends and who I could rely on. So that would have been a very comfortable choice. So that was another thing that made me question if I should move to Europe or not. And then the third thing was finance. I was concerned if I would be able to earn as much in Europe as I did in Singapore. I don't think I was earning like a crazy amount in Singapore. It was probably a normal average salary for a software engineer in the country, and I wasn't sure if Europe would be able to fulfill that as well. So now, here's what happened with these three categories. So first of all, when it comes to work, I went on Glassdoor and LinkedIn, and there were a few, I think these were the two main sites that I used to find a job. And I was able to find some pretty good companies in Berlin specifically. I think Berlin is a more tech city, or that's what I've realized when I was searching for jobs compared to other places in Europe, or at least I looked at only the west side, Milan or Madrid or Amsterdam or Paris. So when I looked at these other cities in comparison, Berlin seemed to have the most number of tech companies there. So it was like a default choice for me because it just had way more options than other places. So because I was able to find quite a few companies in Berlin that would be able to give me the same amount of growth as in Singapore and probably even more, I was perfectly fine with like leaving the work environment Singapore to moving here. The second thing was social reasons. So that was something that I had to have a lot of conversations with like my friends, my family, my mom specifically. I was 100% going to miss my family, so I had to have a lot of conversations with her about how it would be like if I moved overseas and I've not been away with them for so long other than the year that I was in USA. So because of that, it was tough to make that choice, but because my parents also were immigrants, they are familiar with the need to want to move out of your home country, and they supported my decision like 100%. And my best friend is also someone who doesn't live in Singapore anymore, so because of that we were in a long distance friendship for a while. So since that worked out so comfortably and it was so fine, just thanks to Instagram or like WhatsApp and a lot of online tools right now, it's so easy to stay connected to your friends. So because of that, I realized that yeah, I can't not make this choice because of that reason. And then the third reason is the financial aspect. Finance was like a big reason why I was considering not moving to Germany, because in Germany you pay a ton more taxes because you also pay for social welfare. So whilst you do pay more taxes, you do get more benefits as well. But in Singapore, taxes is considered very low as compared to a lot of other places, especially Germany. I think they might be like literally two sides of the coin, like two completely opposite sides. So because of that, if I was in Singapore and I was living with my family, I was like not paying rent, not paying for groceries because I was living with my family, I would have lived a very comfortable life where I saved a lot of money, which here I don't get the chance to do that because I have to pay a lot of taxes, I have to pay rent, I have to pay groceries, I have to pay for a lot of random things that you need if you live by yourself or you live outside of your parents' nest. So because of that, I actually considered like not moving to Germany even after I got the job offer, just because I didn't want to save less money. But after talking to a lot of people about this as well, I realized that I was making a very stupid decision and my mindset was very wrong. I cannot compare living with my parents and the amount of money that I would save then versus living by myself and the amount of money I would save then, because that's like comparing apples to oranges. Instead, I should compare how it would be if I lived in Singapore and I lived by myself versus if I lived in Germany, Berlin specifically, and I lived by myself. And in that comparison, like Berlin always won because rent in Singapore is crazy expensive. In fact, a lot of people only only move out of their parents' house when they're ready to buy, because rent itself is just so expensive. So after I compared that financial side of it, I was like, okay, Berlin is the better choice financially as well. So these are the 3 criteria that I knew I had to think about and make a very, very conscious decision before intending to move to another country. And once I was like okay with these 3 factors, I decided to take the plunge and fly here. And I haven't been back in Singapore ever since. So why did I choose Berlin out of any other place in Europe? For me, a big factor was that my partner was in Berlin, so it would have been a very comfortable move, as I already knew someone there that was familiar with the place, knew the language and things like that. And another reason was that Berlin actually has a lot more tech companies from what I searched for as compared to a lot of other cities in Europe. And you also get paid more as a software engineer in Berlin as compared to other major cities. But of course, this depends on the company that you're at as well. If you are in Amazon or like a FAANG company in Milan, and if you're like in a smaller startup in Berlin, you might get paid more as FAANG engineer in Milan. So it really depends. But if you look at the average, I think Berlin engineers do earn more compared to other places in Europe, or that was the stats that I looked at. And cost of living in Berlin is also not crazy high so far. I wouldn't even call it a very crowded city. I think it's very decently sized, because I come from one of the highest population density cities/countries in the world, which is Singapore. So because of that, it's not a fair comparison, but Berlin feels pretty empty is an exaggeration, but like not crowded as compared to other places. So that's why Berlin just ended up being an easy choice. And I've never ever traveled to Berlin before I actually ended up moving here. So with that being said, we now know the decision-making process of why I ended up choosing Berlin, as well as what I was considering before moving here from Singapore. I then had to apply for jobs. And I think the application process was relatively simple because I just did everything online because of Corona. So nobody made me fly anywhere to interview. All of my interviews were online. But just at the company that I am in now, the interview process was a lot longer than other companies. I think it took around 2 months. So that was the longest period. Like I started applying in starting of Feb, like 1st Feb or 2nd Feb. And I got my offer in March, mid-March or something. So it was a pretty long process, I would say. I don't know what I have to compare because my previous interview in Singapore was literally just 1 day. I don't know if all companies are like that. There were a lot of companies in Berlin as well that the process was a lot shorter, but because of time difference and stuff, it was harder to find common times. But once I did, the process was pretty fast from then onward, which is when we come to the visa process. After I got the offer, and since I was a overseas candidate who had to be like flown into Berlin, the company actually assigned a lawyer to me, and they do this for a lot of people. I'm not special. It just sounds cool that they assigned me a lawyer, but it was pretty normal. So the lawyer would basically look at my documents, my education, and look at the best visa that can be suitable for me given the salary that I would be earning and things like that. So with that in mind, I ended up getting the EU Blue Card visa, which is a visa that gives you some special benefits around the European Union. It's like an upgraded work visa, I would say. And it's not specific to Germany, but you can use it around European Union. But to be able to get the EU Blue Card visa, you need to fulfill some criteria, and one of which is that your degree that you have should match the job scope or the role that you are applying for. So I'm applying for software engineer and my degree is in computer engineering. So since they match, it was a simple process, but I did have to wait for a month for the German government, I think like the education ministry, to validate that my degree is legit actually, because I got my degree from a Singapore university and not a German university or like anywhere in the European Union. So because of that, they have to do some validations around that. But basically that took 1 month, like that validation process. And once that was done, I went to the German embassy in Singapore, I applied, and I got the approval like I think the same day or the next day. So it was very, very fast. So after the visa process, I flew there. And the first major thing that I was pretty concerned about is whether I need to be able to speak German at the job, because I didn't at all. But it was amazing because on my first day we had like a orientation sort of vibe where a lot of the new employees that would join the same day as me were given an onboarding to the company, the products, as well as their work policies and the culture of the company. And one of the things that was specified or like highlighted is the fact that everyone should only speak English, because my company is very diverse. So there's people who speak Spanish, Italian, French, Hindi, a lot of languages. So because of that, you don't want someone who doesn't speak the language to be outcasted or to feel out of place. So that's why everyone is not forced, but like encouraged to speak English all the time. So that was something that was like a sigh of relief for me, because then I didn't have to speak German at work, which was a very big plus since I definitely was not a German speaker. But of course, that was something that was already specified in the job requirements as well, because if a company does require you to speak German, they tend to write that in the job description. But I just wasn't sure if like other discussions in the company would happen in German or not, but in this case they would not. So that was a big plus. Another thing that's still surprising to me after 1 year of working there is the working hours. It's a lot chiller than in Singapore, if I can compare. And of course, I do have to caveat and say that I'm not comparing two countries, I'm just comparing my two experiences. It could be completely different for another company in Germany or another company in Singapore. So this is just my experiences. In Singapore, I have realized that the work culture there is very hustle-ish, where, like I mentioned just now, you are very motivated to make more money and to get a better house, provide better for your family. It's a very systematic path that people tend to follow, and I probably would have done that as well if I chose to keep staying in Singapore. But here, on the other hand, people work, but work is not their life. In fact, in the office, if you stay after 5:30, 6, almost no one is around. And it's not like they come in the office extremely early. Like, you don't see people there like 6:30, 7, or at least not that I know of. But they still get the work done and they have a life after work. So that was something that was a big culture shock for me work-wise, because I wasn't used to that. In Singapore, I remember the first 6 months of my first job after graduating from university, I was working in the company until like 10, 11, and like taking work home and like getting something done. But that could also be because I was a new engineer and wanted to prove that I understood what was going on and like learn new stuff. That was one of the reasons, and also because I felt like this is normal and this is what I'm supposed to do. Here, on the other hand, nobody forces you to work more than you need to, and nobody actually keeps a track of when you're in the office, when you're leaving, or anything of that sort. It's extremely chill. It's very dependent a lot on what you produce work-wise rather than how much time you spend doing it. So that's something that I really appreciate, and I'm still surprised sometimes at how chill things are here. And it's not like the workload is very little, but just that people give a lot more importance to your well-being, how you're feeling about it, and making sure that like your mental health is good, and that whole spiel. Because of the working hours, by default there's a lot more work-life balance here, which was also a cultural shock. I feel like people here don't live to work, they work to live, while in Singapore it just felt like a very live to work kind of life. But of course, again, this is my experience. You can 100% live in Singapore and have a work to live mindset that's 100% dependent on you. There's also way more diversity here as compared to Singapore, although Singapore in general is a multicultural country where we have 3 main races: Chinese, Malays, and Indians. But it's diverse, but the type of diversity is also different. I feel like over here I've met a lot more people who are from Europe, of course, and from South America. There are, for some reason, a lot of engineers from South America, like Brazil or Colombia. So you meet quite a few people from very different parts of the world, like the West basically, that I didn't get the opportunity of meeting them in Singapore. So that was something else that was like a, I wouldn't say a cultural shock, but just it feels like there's a lot more diversity in Berlin from the West. For obvious reasons, it's closer to the West, it's in the West, so it just makes sense. But that's just something that I realized. Like, I was having a lot of conversations with people from these different countries that I probably would not have if I was in Singapore, unless I had put in a lot of effort to find these people and meet them. And that was actually very interesting to me, because the lifestyle that I've lived in Singapore seems to be very different to the lifestyle that a lot of people who grew up in like the western part of Europe have lived. And also because sometimes it feels like I'm back in 30 years ago whenever I do stuff here. Like, the bureaucracy in Germany is pretty old school. Like, they still post letters, for example, and that's just a very small example of how old school they are. So yes, in summary, small things like the working hours, the work-life balance, like the emphasis put on that, the different conversations that you have here as opposed to the conversations that you would potentially have in Singapore are pretty different, and I think they do contribute to a slight culture shock or like a cultural difference. But I think the more I live here and the more I experience it, I do value it a lot, and I realize this is the type of environment that I would find myself succeeding in the most, but especially when it comes to working. Because I realized that in Singapore I used to put in way more hours, but I don't think I was a good engineer then, and I feel like I'm a much better engineer now, because here I sleep 8 hours a night at least, and I get a good night's of rest. I get to do things other than work, like being a software engineer, that fulfill me creatively or like socially, and add to that battery life that I guess everyone has in the different aspects of it, like, you know, your social life, your work life, your creativity, so small things like this. So I feel like because of that, the next day when I go to work, even though I might not have worked so many hours, I can still contribute a lot more. I can come up with better ideas, I can communicate a lot better, I remember things a lot better. So because of these things, I think I get to be a better engineer here as compared to Singapore. All in all, I think work life here is a lot better for me personally as compared to Singapore. So with that being said, this was a long video about working here and all that gist and spiel around it in general. If you have any questions, or if you worked in Germany or overseas in Europe or even in Singapore and you have experiences around that you want to share, or anything to ask, feel free to add those down below. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.